Satanists, rich kids who don't know any limits, rules don't apply to them, and those possessed by the devil. You can talk about Kharkiv for a long time, in many different ways, just like you can about any other city in our beautiful country. However, this episode is about some of its worst representatives, Kharkiv. You will hear about the murder of an entire family on Lucifer's orders, the deaths of innocent pedestrians who were just walking home from work, and finally about the sacrifice of a young man at a cemetery. These are real events that took place in the City of the Sun, as Jadan sang. If possible, make yourselves comfortable, dear ones, for this is Kharkiv, and it's terrifying. On the night of November 30th to December 1st, 2008 people appeared at cemetery number 15 in Kharkiv. 5 young people were slowly walking around the area, looking around to make sure no one was watching them. The group was led by a girl. The nighttime visitors' caution at the cemetery was not in vain. The plan this group was about to carry out definitely didn't need any extra witnesses. The young people were dressed in black and had with them, let's say, some rather unusual items. Metal pipes, a knife, a machete, and a book. Around 4 in the morning, the girl gave the command. It's time to begin. She took the book she had brought with her and started to read. Spells came from her lips. Then another young man stood up. He picked up a metal pipe and struck the boy standing in front of him on the head twice with a powerful swing. He fell immediately, but the attacker kept hitting him with the pipe, aiming for his temple. The girl, who had been reciting spells from the book, fell silent and picked up a utility knife. She approached the boy with the fractured skull and calmly slit his throat. Then she started to fuss, but not because she was frightened by what she had just done. She took out several cups and filled them with the blood from the young man's body, who had been alive just a few seconds ago. The girl handed one cup to her colleague, so to speak, and kept another for herself. Having made sure the job was done, the young people raised the cups to their lips and drank the fresh blood, standing right next to their victim. After that, they placed the body in the old tomb and left the cemetery. On December 1st, Hennady Pustovid was confused. His son, 18-year-old Sashko, was not answering his phone and did not show up for his driving lessons, where he was supposed to have his first class that day. This was very unusual for Sashko, as his father, a police officer, had disciplined him since childhood. If running late, inform others. In case of an incident, make a call. Typical parental advice, but Sashko always followed it because, as his father said, he was obedient. Alexander was always described only in a positive way. According to Alexander Bondarenko, Sashko's older cousin, Sashko was quite a smart guy.
He wasn't reaching for the stars, but he wasn't falling behind either. He knew computers well, could make a website, and was good with software. I'm 10 years older than him, but he knew and could do more than I ever could.
Well, being smart and not coming home at 18 are two different things, as you can see, and you'd be right. One doesn't interfere with the other, but Sashko was also responsible. On December 1st, he was set to attend driving school to realize some of his life goals. At one time, the young man went to vocational school to get a trade. However, he dropped out of the institution. At 18, he decisively chose to enlist in the army to later become a police officer. Sashko planned to follow in his father's footsteps.
We talked a lot about his future, and Sashko decided that he wanted to work in the police. However, for that he needed to serve in the army. He was supposed to be drafted in the fall. But there were a lot of people, so Sasha was left for the spring. He has received his military identification. He was offered to take a driving course at the military enlistment office's expense before the next draft. Everything was planned out. After the army, he was going to work in the police and study. The first class at the school was supposed to take place on December 1st. So when he left home on November 30th, I was absolutely calm about it. Yes, my son took his passport and said he would stay that night at his female friend's place. And in the morning, he would just go to the courses from there.
Sashko had a girlfriend. At least that's what his relatives thought. He met 20-year-old Olena on the internet. He actually only met girls online. The guy was extremely shy, and it seemed that approaching someone and getting to know them just on the street was, let's say, a mission impossible for him.
My Sasha was always a homebody, a very ordinary, normal, and trusting child. His mom and I separated a long time ago, but after he turned 18 he moved in with me. I never had any particular problems with my son. Most of the time he spent his free time on the computer. It was there, on one of the forums, that he met a girl. I remember he called me over to look at her photo. She was just an ordinary girl, nothing special, but my son liked her, and soon he had already arranged a date with her. He often did this, met people online and then went out on dates.
Which forum it was and exactly when, meaning on what day Sasha met Olena, is generally unknown. It was around autumn, but for the story that doesn't really matter. What's more interesting is something else. After meeting her, Sasha made new friends who often called him at home. And also, the boy had some strange literature appear on his shelf next to the manuals about locksmithing, which he once wanted to do. So next to the textbooks, there was a book of spells, although few people paid much attention to it. 5.
For a while he had some conversations about the devil. Sometimes he would put on some upside-down crosses or say something strange. But it was more like teenage antics, trying to stand out, to say something out of the ordinary.
His father said that his son was a rocker. He listened to Deep Purple, so the black clothes and bracelets or rings didn't particularly surprise him. That same cousin was convinced that Sashko, shortly before his disappearance, actually started laughing at his recently found company. He said, why do I need these idiots? But if he didn't consider his new acquaintances to be idiots, it seems this didn't apply to the girl, Olena. She was actually quite complicated, and Olena, whom Sashko met, was deeply interested in various occult things, topics of magic and the supernatural. Olena read fortunes with cards, predicted the future with runes, claimed she could brew healing potions, and also said she could communicate with spirits. The girl was even prosecuted for hooliganism and desecration of graves. That's how originally she spent her free time. Moreover, Olena belonged to a sect. Well, actually, not even that. She herself founded this sect with her boyfriend, and of course, she declared herself the High Priestess. The sect, named the Mountain Mass, believed in dark forces and the literal night. This organization, initiated by Olena and her partner, appeared in 2007. During the events in question, Olena was the High Priestess, her boyfriend was the High Priest, and they had followers. 4 people. After meeting the priestess, Sashko also became one of the followers. An attentive viewer like you would say something like,
Wait, but you said that Sasha liked Olena, went on dates with her, and now it turns out she had a boyfriend, and not just anyone, but the High Priest himself? What kind of confusion is this?
Well, first of all, I'll say that this isn't confusion, but rather publicly available information. And whether Olena the priestess actually considered Sasha her boyfriend, or at least potentially saw him as her partner, I don't know. Well, I can't get inside her head, and unfortunately I probably don't have any forbidden books either. Could I maybe do a little magic there or something? Maybe the girl was just messing with the guy's head, and maybe the sex principles and the lady's life views permitted her to have multiple partners simultaneously. Let me remind you that we are talking about a community called Mountain Mass, with a belief in dark forces and the night. I suppose there might not have been any restrictions there at all, especially considering what later happened to Sashko. And secondly, meet Ms. Barkova, who helped film this episode.
Hello, I'll be happy to see you on my channel, but more on that a bit later. First, let's deal with the case. So, after the boy disappeared from the radar, his father tried to find him on his own for several days. He contacted friends and visited his son's usual hangouts. On day 5 of the disappearance, Hennedy reported it to the police. However, the search dragged on and they only called the man on December 21st, and it was not with good news. That day, workers at the 15th City Cemetery noticed something strange. Dogs started running to one of the graves and digging there. They were pulling something out and fighting over it. Eventually, the cemetery caretakers decided to check what was going on. They assumed there might have been the corpse of another animal there, or maybe one of the deceased's relatives had left food on the grave when they visited. And the dogs decided it was for them. If only it were that simple. Well,
to say that the scene the workers saw when they approached the strange location shocked them would be an understatement. It was an old metal coffin with the frozen body of a young man inside. His right hand and face had been gnawed by animals. and they were so badly mutilated that it was difficult to identify the person. Of course, the cemetery workers immediately called the police to the scene, and then everything went according to the standard procedure. Police and forensic experts arrived, searched the scene, and examined the body. Officers found a passport in the victim's pockets. Hours later, Hennadai Pustovit's phone rang. A cold voice spoke on the other end of the phone. Of course, the shocked man jumped up from his seat that very second and rushed to the scene. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. When
They found a passport and the keys to my apartment on him. I recognized him by the description of his belongings and by the photographs.
At first, they didn't even let my father see the body. There was no standard identification procedure to establish the person's identity. The body was so badly mutilated. As the murdered man's family grieved, police searched for the culprits. Ms. Barkova will provide more details.
Within 3 days, the suspects were at the police station. In particular, the high priestess and priest in civilian life, Olena Nacheporuk and Serhiy Bodanov. During the search of their shared apartment, where the priestesses and their followers resided together, let me remind you, they found a number of items that indicated these people were not ordinary. Law enforcement officers seized a crossbow, a leather whip, and various amulets, such as one shaped like a 5-pointed star. They also found a lot of literature. The residents of the apartment studied the New Testament, the Psalter, practical magic, as well as the book Maniaki, Chronicles of Death. But it wasn't this literature that drew the special attention of law enforcement, but rather a diary that the author called the Book of Reflections. One of the main challenges for the investigation was to find out who this diary belonged to. The unknown author began writing it on February 18th, 2008 at least. That's the date indicated on the first page. The thing is, the lines that were written caused concern and raised even more questions. Here's an example, one excerpt. Shame on me. Take me to the executioner. I am not worthy of life. The investigators assumed that this diary might have belonged to the murdered Sasha, and this somewhat changed the situation with the charges brought against the suspects. After all, during the interrogations, the 20-year-old sect member and the 22-year-old sect member stated that Sasha was one of them and that he had voluntarily sacrificed himself. The young man allegedly had, I quote, personal issues. So, did he literally ask them to solve these problems in an extremely horrific way? As for the relatives...
You see, the family members were, of course, shocked by such statements and assumptions. The boy's father immediately told the media that this is a lie that has nothing to do with reality. They assumed that shortly before the murder, the boy was given something to drink, something that shut down his ability to think clearly. Next, actually, are the father's words.
I don't believe that he voluntarily allowed himself to be killed. There is evidence that he was given something to drink, and, according to all satanic canons, brothers from the same sect are not sacrificed to the unclean one. Only innocent souls, babies, submissive girls, and those who do not acknowledge the devil. And he did not acknowledge him. That's why he was killed.
The murdered man's cousin told journalists in the comments that he had never, not once in his life, seen Sashko keep a diary.
What diary? What are we talking about? He never had any diaries in his life. He never wrote anything at all. He loved spending time on the computer, but I haven't seen him with a pen in a very long time.
And all of this could be true. However, the brother himself said that a few days before his death, Sashko wrote to one of his friends on the internet.
But I really want to take a look.
Not all diaries are handwritten, of course, and the printed words sent online, nevertheless, don't sound all that positive. So maybe Sasha's life wasn't as joyless as his family imagined. Only Sasha likely knew the answer. However, his cousin mentioned that he recently faced difficulties.
I think Sanya only recently started truly living. He began to laugh and enjoy life. He found a purpose. A few months ago, there was a confusing period in his life when he didn't know why he was living or what he should do. But my friends loved him very much, and they are older and wiser than me. And he listened to my friends, even more than to me. So after talking to them, he decided to move in with Dad, join the army, and get a job.
The investigation into the cemetery murder lasted until September 2009. During this time, the suspect's testimonies changed several times, and in the end, nothing remained of the original story about a ritual at the cemetery performed by Satanists. The high priestess, so-called, and the priest retracted their statements about sacrificing Sashko and drinking his blood. In short, they denied almost everything I told you at the beginning of this story. In court, they stated that they gave these testimonies under pressure from law enforcement authorities. In the end, when the court delivered the verdict, it relied on their other statements. In the news story, everything was more prosaic, not as mystical, though no less eerie. So, the Mountain Mass sect, with its belief in dark forces and the night, really did exist, and Olena truly considered herself the main priestess. The organization's rules boiled down to the fact that the followers must always obey the words of the priestess, and none of the sect's members could leave its ranks. Both the priestess, the priest, and the followers mostly lived together because some members of the sect had trouble renting a place to live. Olena never explicitly promised to teach them how to make money, only possibly potions. In that sense, it's somewhat fair. The relationships between the members of this group were friendly. However, no one had the right to challenge the authority of the priestess. There was a reason such a promise was made at the start. Young people, when gathering together, spent their free time as a group. They brewed potions, studied white and black magic, and practiced fortune-telling. Interestingly, Olena herself said that she never practiced occultism. What she did, in the girl's view, simply didn't fall under that definition. On November 30th, Sashko came to the apartment of the sect members with a serious intention. He needed to talk to Olena. Calling her into a separate room, away from the others, he announced that he was going to leave the organization. He didn't accept the objections that he couldn't do that because he had made a promise at the start. Well, at least not if it was serious. The guy said that the conversation was over and that he was going to sleep because he had to go to a driving course in the morning, as you remember. Olena left him alone, but then went to have a few words with her partner Serhi, the priest. Olena was a little scared. In the conversation, she explained that Sasha wanted to leave, but the problem was not only that, but also the fact that his father works in the police. If Sashko tells him about the sect, they will all be held accountable. What should they do in this situation? Well, Olena decided that the best solution was to kill Sashko. That's exactly what she suggested to Serhi. He apparently was under some influence of the girl. After all, when they met, he wasn't involved in magic and rituals, but after spending a lot of time with Olena, he became deeply influenced by the ideas the girl believed in. So Olena and Serhi started discussing how best to kill Sasha. This conversation took place away from the other two people present in the apartment. They chose the cemetery as the place for the murder, since there would be no one there at night, and they wanted to act right away. They agreed to kill with metal pipes that were lying in the apartment. They planned to hit the head with them. Serhi hesitated, but Olena assured him she would help if he couldn't handle it himself. She was not just a partner, but a dream. They also agreed that Olena should distract Sasha so that Serhi could secretly swing and deliver the first blow. At that moment, members of the congregation entered the room. They overheard part of the conversation about the pipes and asked what it was about. The priest had no choice but to lie, saying that the pipes were needed to use them as candlesticks. The congregation was interested in this suggestion, so two more members of the sect said they wanted to join the ritual. And they joined. Sasha was woken up and told that they were going to the cemetery to summon spirits, and they invited him to come along. For some reason he agreed. Serhi, the same chief priest, in order not to arouse unnecessary suspicion, took not only the pipes but also a utility knife. He explained his decision by saying that the knife was needed to cut candles, although, in the end, no one actually brought any candles. The young people got onto the cemetery grounds through a hole in the wall. At that time, it was around 3 or 4 in the morning. Olena took the group to a secluded area of the cemetery, stating it was the ideal location for the ritual. When everyone stopped, the girl called out to Sasha. He turned toward her, and at that moment, Serhi pulled out from his jacket sleeve the pipes he intended to use to kill Sashko. He threw one aside and struck Sasha on the head with the other. He beat him for about 30 seconds, but that was more than enough to fracture the boy's skull. After the first blow, Sashko fell to the ground, groaning and wheezing. 5 seconds later, Olena checked his pulse. The boy's heart was still beating. Then she and Serhi lifted the body by the head and legs and carried it into an abandoned empty tomb. To cover up the traces of the crime, they threw plants they had picked nearby into the tomb. The members of the congregation who followed the leader to summon spirits did nothing. To avoid making anything up, I'll just say what's stated in the court documents. One of them seemed to be in shock because he just stood still, and the other was probably crying. They also took a phone out of Sashko's pocket. On the way home, it was taken apart and thrown away along with the pipes. When they returned to the apartment, all 4 agreed that they wouldn't tell the other 2 members of the sect anything. They made up a different story about Sashko's disappearance, like the guy got offended by a joke and decided to leave the group. That's it. The next morning, no one discussed what had happened. So, who was punished in
the end, out of the 4 detained, only 2 ended up in the dock. The already mentioned priestesses, Olena Nechiporuk and Serhiy Bodanov. They were charged under the article for intentional murder, but not everything went smoothly in court. In July 2010, for example, the judge granted the motion of the main priestess's defender and sent the case for further investigation. The reason was a significant number of inaccuracies in the case. At least that's what the defendant's defender believed. However, the prosecutor did not give up. He appealed this decision in the higher court. And eventually the case was sent back to the Court of Appeals of the Kharkiv region for review. Only 3 years after this inhuman crime was committed, on November 21, 2011, the panel of judges announced the verdict. It turned out to be less than the punishment requested by the prosecution. The prosecution emphasized the need to imprison the perpetrators for 15 years each. But the court decided otherwise. The priestess ultimately received 13 years in prison, and the priest got 14 because he was identified as the perpetrator of the murder. In addition, both convicts had to pay the victims, that is, Sasha's relatives, moral and material compensation of 68,000 hryvnias. Olena's mother, Nechiporuk, was shocked by the verdict and continued to claim that her daughter's testimony was forced out of her. Here,
6 people among the defendants, because there was torture, everything was given under pressure, and the result...
The girl's lawyer is convinced that the law enforcement officers planned from the beginning to convict his client. And that's why they built their version in such a way that Olena was automatically considered guilty. In fact, no one really tried to get to the truth.
Both the investigation's position and the prosecutor's position were accusatory, and the entire accusation was based solely on assumptions and suppositions.
After the verdict was announced, Bodanova's lawyer, priest Ihor Davidov, stated that his client was punished too harshly.
Definitely, he is guilty, he admitted it, and he sincerely repented. The relatives partially compensated the victim for the material damage. He could have potentially received a shorter sentence.
But Sasha's father agreed with the verdict and did not file an appeal.
I'm just sure that it was a ritual murder because my son was a sociable person, as young people say. He was friendly, he wasn't evil to anyone.
For the father, one of the main positive aspects, even in this case, there is a positive aspect, was that his son was no longer labeled as a Satanist or a suicide. This case became incredibly high profile, with nearly everyone in Kharkiv discussing it at the time, and the news that Sasha was a follower of occultism, worshipped the devil, and committed suicide even reached the clergy. Because of this, they actually refused to bury the boy according to Orthodox traditions. When everything fell into place, the parents were finally able to bid farewell to their son, as is customary in most Ukrainian families. There weren't too many people at Sashko's funeral. The same can't be said about the funerals of those who became victims in the next story. Back then, hundreds were crying in the cemeteries. On October 18th, 2017, one of the bloodiest car accidents in Ukraine's history occurred. The whole country was talking about this event, and the whole country was probably following the investigation and then the trial. It was nearly 9 post-meridium in the center of Kharkiv. I know exactly how it all unfolded. A Lexus car driven by a young girl is speeding at a crazy pace from the direction of Constitution Square. At the same time, a Volkswagen Touareg driven by a man is going up Bersatsky descent. At 20:53, the Lexus enters the intersection, doing so while the traffic light is red. The driver of the Volkswagen decides to step on the gas when the light is yellow. As a result, a collision occurs between the Volkswagen and the Lexus. The impact throws the Lexus onto the sidewalk near the crosswalk. 11 pedestrians are standing at this intersection. After the collision, the Lexus knocks down a traffic light, crashes into the crowd, and overturns. 27-year-old Alexander Yevteyev, 46-year-old Natalia Umayeva, 28-year-old Nina Kobesova, 46-year-old Alla, and 19-year-old Anastasia Sokil. All of them die at the scene. A few days later, 20-year-old Diana Berchenko dies in the hospital from severe injuries without regaining consciousness. The ambulance takes 5 more injured people to the hospitals. These are Oksana Nestorenko, Yuri Nudachin, Olena Barchenko, and Anna Komar. In addition, pregnant Zhana Vlasenko also ends up in the hospital ward. The woman is in her 20th week. To save the child, the specialists had to put her into a medically induced coma. Luckily, she will wake up later, get discharged, and deliver her baby. But no one can bring the other 6 victims back to life, and their deaths are on the conscience of those who were driving the Volkswagen and the Lexus that evening. The driver of the Lexus turned out to be Olena Zaitseva, who at that time was a third-year student at the Faculty of Sociology of Kharkiv National University, named after Karazin. In the media and among the public, she was quickly labeled as a Majorka, a spoiled rich kid, despite her friends and family denying it. And this didn't happen for no reason. You see, she wasn't just an ordinary student. The investigation established that the girl is also the stepsister of the illustrated former deputy prosecutor of the Cherkasy region, Dmytro Zaitsev. He held the position since the time of the scandalously infamous Pshonka in 2013. By the way, at the time of the accident, Zaitsev was wanted and was hiding in Moscow. And also Zaitseva is the stepdaughter of businessman Vasil Zaitsev. He is the general director of Ukrenergokermet. The Lexus that crashed into the crowd was registered to Vasil Zaitsev. The girl received her driver's license in December 2015. And since then, she has repeatedly come to the attention of law enforcement for violating traffic rules. To be precise, she was officially caught doing this 6 times. Each time she got off with a small fine. In total, over 2 years, she paid about 1,800 hryvnias. To be exact, it was 1,785. At the first court hearings in the case about the fatal accident, the driver cried the whole time and refused to explain anything about the crash.
The only thing I want to say is that I'm sorry about this situation. People were hurt. I hope that the families will still allow my parents to help them, because this is truly the worst thing that could have happened.
By the way, in the first month after the accident, Zaitseva's mother really transferred 50,000 hryvnias each as moral compensation to the victims and the relatives of those who died in the accident. Most of them returned the money to her because they didn't want to take anything from the woman who gave birth to and raised an irresponsible rich girl.
The second participant in the incident is Hennady Dronov, the Volkswagen driver. Before becoming one of those responsible for the accident, the man traded food products and tobacco goods and also rented out real estate. It is known that shortly before the fatal car crash, in the same year, 2017, but in April, Dronov was involved in a traffic accident for which he was held administratively liable in June of that year. So, both of them drove like that, let's put it that way. At the time of the fatal accident, he was sober, and after the crash that evening, he immediately went to the investigator. Later, he visited a private clinic doctor. He was diagnosed with a concussion and chest contusion. Dronov's case is interesting because, as the Volkswagen driver, he was initially involved as a witness. His lawyer even tried to get Dronov recognized as a victim. However, on November 6, Dronov himself emerged as a second suspect in the Sumskaya accident case. The conclusion that both drivers, Dronov and Zaitseva, violated traffic rules was reached by investigators after a comprehensive automotive technical examination and the testimonies of people who were at the scene and survived.
The video recordings reviewed by the court today proved that both parties in the case violated traffic rules. The driver of the Lexus, 20-year-old Olena Zaitseva, and the driver of the Volkswagen Touareg, 49-year-old Hennady Dronov, both of them had the opportunity to see each other and avoid the collision. The first video recording shows that at the moment of the collision, Zaitseva enters the intersection on a red light, while Dronov starts moving on a yellow light.
And on one hand, everything in this story is absolutely clear. There is a traffic accident with many victims, a fatal accident. There are those responsible, whose names are known. There should be a trial and a verdict. But when it came to the investigation and establishing the details, a real circus began. Important details for establishing the circumstances were juggled during the proceedings. One of the key points that needed to be established concerned the presence of narcotic substances in Zaitseva's body. The first time it became known about opiates in her urine was on October 20, 2017, when the court was choosing a preventive measure. Prosecutor Maxim Blokhin provided the medical examination conclusions. The presence of opiates in the girl's body was recorded in the examination report and in the results of the initial study. During the court proceedings, pressured by victims' representatives, this data and 2 toxicological examinations were added to the case materials.
But the fact of detecting opiates was not included in the indictment, because, according to prosecutor Valery Bukhan, further studies did not detect such substances. How is this possible? It's all because the small amount of blood provided prevented confirmation of the presence of opiates. Instead of the required 50 ml of blood, only 5 ml was provided to laboratory Dr. Alexander Chubenko, who was called at the request of the victims. So, according to the expert, it was impossible to state that Olena Zaitseva was under the influence of drugs. Olena Zaitseva herself stated that she had suffered a head injury earlier, back in her teenage years, because of which she needed to undergo a medical examination every 6 months. She was also on medication. So, the opiates could have appeared in her system from the medication she allegedly took before the accident. For the victims' representatives, the issue of opiates was fundamental. This could have been an aggravating circumstance that would prevent the judge from reducing the prison sentence.
But there's an interesting nuance. One of the witnesses, the narcologist Dr. Olena Fedorko, who examined the driver for the presence of opiates right after the accident and took material for analysis, actually disappeared. Later, it became known that she had resigned from her job. They managed to question the woman only 6 months after the search began. She appeared in court suddenly. She stated that during the entire search period, she remained in the Kharkiv region without receiving any calls or summons from investigators. She claimed no knowledge of the high-profile case. Coincidentally, her home's electricity was cut off, leaving her unreachable by phone. Is that possible? Well, I suppose it's unlikely. Ultimately, the woman was questioned as a key witness for nearly 3 hours. She verified the details in Zaitseva's post-accident inspection report. Unstable mood, lethargy, sluggishness, pale skin, constricted pupils, unsteady gait. But the narcologist attributed all this to a state of shock and a concussion, which, by the way, other doctors did not find in Zaitseva. When asked whether the test results showed if Zaitseva was under the influence of drugs, she stated that no drugs were detected. But later, after several clarifying questions during the interrogation, she agreed that opiates were indeed found in Zaitseva. Here is an excerpt from the dialogue between the lawyers and Fedorko.
So tell us again, what was found in Mrs. Zaitseva's urine? Opiates? Yes, so is that a narcotic state or not?
No.
Explain the presence of opiates in the urine. What does that indicate?
That there were opiates in her body, but it's not possible to say that she was under the influence of drugs.
You understand it's extremely difficult to determine anything based on such evidence. Another point is the speed at which Zaitseva was driving. Almost immediately after the accident, both witnesses and officials from law enforcement spoke out. The Lexus was speeding toward the intersection at a crazy speed. Dronov, the other person involved in the accident, told journalists in his first interview that he couldn't react in time to the events on the road. It was because of the speed of the car, Zaitseva's car. However, the indictment did not specify the exact speed. It only stated that the sport utility vehicle was moving at no less than 80 kilometers per hour. At that time, the prosecution said they requested exact figures from the experts. But auto mechanic Kostiantin Kuznetsov, who based his calculations on the car's sensor readings, stated that Zaitseva was speeding at 102 kilometers per hour. The data is in the case materials, but because witness Kuznetsov could not explain when exactly the Lexus was moving at that speed, the 102 kmph was not included in the indictment. Therefore, they were not used during the automotive technical examinations. Not?
The court-appointed supplementary automotive technical examination by experts from the Bukharias Kharkiv Research Institute of Forensic Examinations did not provide further clarity. Specialists from Dnipro later determined what the Kharkiv experts could not and wrote about it in British Broadcasting Corporation, Ukraine. According to their calculations, the average speed of the Lexus was 106 kilometers per hour. This figure and several other facts were important. Zaitseva's defense insisted that the girl, regardless of the speed of her sport utility vehicle, could not have avoided the accident. Instead, Dronov could have done it. But according to experts who also calculated the distance between the cars, Olena Zaitseva had the opportunity to avoid the accident. All she needed to do was drive at the speed allowed by law.
As you can see, there are certain questions about the work of the experts in this case. A case was even opened against the employees of the Kharkiv Regional Bureau of Forensic Medical Examinations. The reason is deliberately false testimony, since they were unable to calculate the speed of Zaitseva's Lexus. But the case was eventually closed because the investigation did not find any signs of a criminal offense in the actions of the forensic experts. And what about the perpetrators themselves, who were still suspects at the time? In their closing statements, both Zaitseva and Dronov were not emotional and limited themselves to rather brief remarks.
I regret it, so I accept all the claims and will try, together with my mother, to pay them off as much as I can. I am ready to take responsibility and accept whatever punishment the court assigns me.
I understand my involvement in this, and I regret it. I have asked for forgiveness more than once, both in court and in my cell before God. I ask for forgiveness every day.
Ultimately, Zaitseva and Dronov received their punishments. On February 26, 2019, the Kyiv District Court of Kharkiv sentenced Olena Zaitseva to 10 years in prison. Hennady Dronov also received the same prison sentence. The convicted individuals also had to pay over 7 million hryvnias in victim compensation. Within a month of the verdict being announced, both Dronov and Zaitseva appealed it. However, without success. And in April 2020, the colleagues of the judges of the Cassation Criminal Court finally left unchanged the verdict of the first and the decision of the appellate instance regarding these two. In 2023, it became known that Zaitseva even refused the benefit provided by law. It gave her the right to early release. Theoretically, this can be explained by two reasons. The first is that the girl has repented so much that she wants to serve her full prison term. Well, like, to atone for her guilt in this way. But there is also a second reason. She wrote a refusal because often the authorities and courts deny prisoners when they first ask to be released early. There is a possibility that Zaitseva simply decided not to spoil her prison record with a refusal from the court, and instead she wanted to wait until her sentence is reduced even further. After that, she can try to take advantage of the privilege, because then she will have a much better chance of success. So now both Dronov and Zaitseva remain behind bars. The main figure in the next case is also not free at the moment. However, unlike the case with Zaitseva and Dronov, things there are much less clear, so to speak. At 20, Mykyta seemed like a decent guy. He was born in Germany and lived there for a while, but since his whole family was in Kharkiv, Mykyta eventually moved to join them. There is little information about his personality and lifestyle, which is likely not a coincidence. The case I'm going to tell you about next is just too bloody. Nevertheless, according to Mykyta's uncle, Dmytro Kalinichenko, the only close relative who agreed to give a brief comment to journalists, the boy did well in school, was calm, and never showed aggression. He had a girlfriend, with whom he lived for some time, and he also worked. Unfortunately, it's not known what his job was, once again. In July 2023, Dmytro Kalinichenko learned that Mykyta would be living at home with his family in Kharkiv. The man took the information calmly. Previously, he was glad that his nephew's life was going well, both personally and professionally. But the uncle also had nothing against the guy living with his family. Well, you know, anything can happen in life. But the uncle didn't know everything about his nephew. He omitted that Mykyta had been arrested by the police multiple times previously. Moreover, the guy had even been taken to court several times. The reason was robberies. So it doesn't seem like the young man's life was even close to calm and measured. Dmytro Kalinichenko last saw Mykyta in person around April, about 2 to 2.5 months prior to the tragedy. Until July 16, Mykyta seemed unchanged, but on that day he transformed completely, and that change led to many deaths. From those closest to him to people the guy had never seen before in his life. So, the first half of the day, July 16, 2023, it's not even 11 o'clock yet. Mykyta, for reasons probably known only to himself, picks up a knife. At home, in the apartment he returned to not so long ago, besides him, there are 3 more people: his younger sister, his mother, and his elderly grandfather. Fully understanding this, with a knife in his hand, Mykyta begins to act. He attacks. First, he goes after his 10-year-old sister. The boy approached her from behind and put the knife to her neck. The first stab, the second. It didn't take much time or effort to take her life. The girl died after 6 wounds. Mykyta went to his grandfather's room. At 71, the old man didn't have much strength left to even try to fight back. He was disabled, and the pensioner hardly ever got out of bed. Nevertheless, the old man tried to fight for his life. With all the strength he had left, the man pushed his grandson away from him, tried to hold his hands, and dodged the blows. He also grabbed the cane that was standing nearby, but it was all in vain. The 20-year-old grandson was stronger and more agile. One stab with the knife, then another, several more. They struck the chest area. Within seconds, the grandfather was already taking his last breaths of his life. At the moment of the attack, Mykyta's mother entered the room from the balcony. Was the woman shocked? I think that's clear without any further explanation. And what did Mykyta do? He went at her with the knife. He swung the weapon to strike, delivering blows one after another, leaving at least 13 wounds on the victim, and then cold-bloodedly slit his mother's throat. The woman died on the spot. What happened next?
Then Mykyta got into a taxi. It was around noon. A blue Daewoo Sens arrived for the call. The guy jumped into the car, but he wasn't in a hurry to say the destination address. Instead, he pulled out the knife he had used just a few minutes earlier to take the lives of his relatives and started threatening the taxi driver. Life is more important than a car, the man obviously thought, so he quickly handed over the keys to the aggressive passenger and got out of the car. Mykyta moved from the passenger seat to the driver's seat and hit the gas. However, he didn't get far. At about 12:25, Mykyta was driving along Vadytsiv-Shironivtsi Street from Bukhmy Street toward Valentinivska. At the section near the intersection with Heroyev-Pratsy Street, he ran a red light and hit a man who was lawfully crossing the road at a green light. The collision turned out to be fatal for the latter. The innocent pedestrian died at the scene. He was 52 years old, but Mykyta kept going. Less than a minute after the tragedy at the crosswalk, that is, at 12:26, the young man collided with another car. Near building number 31 on Valentinivska Street, he crashed into a Devasens. The result was a car crash, during which the 23-year-old driver of the other Devasens suffered serious injuries, a closed head injury and multiple abrasions. Did Mykyta even stop after that? Not at all.
Not at all. He tried to escape from the scene, abandoned the stolen car, and ran into the yard of a residential building. Luckily, the perpetrator didn't get away. Within minutes, he was intercepted by patrol officers, and then the young man was taken to the police station. However, the law enforcement officers were unaware of the severity of the case at that time, and they couldn't even imagine how the 20-year-old Kharkiv resident would explain his actions. Listen for yourself.
On the day when all this happened, I was also not myself. I, roughly speaking, was talking with my uncle. I talked to him for the last time. With whom? With Lucifer. He came to me himself, into my head. I asked him questions, he answered me, and that's how we communicated. The first thing he advised me was that I needed to change my life. Specifically, I needed to help my family.
It's an unusual situation, you have to agree. People don't often give such explanations for actions like these. Did the devil really visit Mykyta? Well, it depends on what you consider the devil, I don't know. I don't believe in that, but you can share your thoughts in the comments. One could assume that he had or still has mental health issues, or that he was using certain substances. Either way, at the time this video was recorded and when Mykyta explained what happened, the guy clearly stated that he was not registered at any psychological or drug treatment facility. And he is not registered now. However, he suggested why the devil came specifically to him. The reason is the girl whom Mykyta broke up with. We thought we would get back together, but she continued living with me and started seeing other guys. On July 8th or...
Around those days, she left me, taking some of her things with her. And that's when I started to hit rock bottom mentally.
And starting from the 10th, from Monday, that's when Lucifer came to me and started to...
Tell me that everything can be changed. Not everything has to be tolerated. And since then, he slowly started getting closer and closer to my broken mind and my broken soul. He was preparing his plan as I understand it now. He needed souls. And he chose me, broken, to take this control and carry out his plan.
He clarified that the voice in his head wasn't there every minute. Generally, things were relatively fine until around 11 a.m. on July 16th.
I got up, everything was fine until I started hearing a voice that began telling me I had to kill my family. Everything was fine until about 11 o'clock in the morning. After that, when the voice made its plan and told me to start carrying it out, I went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, went to the bedroom, and stabbed my younger sister.
I've already told how the events unfolded after that. I won't repeat myself. What's important is something else. If you haven't forgotten, the Kharkiv butcher said that the devil advised him to change his life, though in a very specific and terrifying way. According to the attacker, he could change his life by helping his relatives. But for some reason, this help manifested itself in the form of stab and cut wounds.
Mother returned from the volcano, from the room where grandfather was, yes. He started killing. Because even though
So, Lucifer told me that she needed to be saved. Of course, I didn't want to kill her. Well,
put my brother to sleep in the same place. I came up behind her and started to cut her like an enemy.
He didn't specify exactly what the young man was supposed to save his mother from. And overall, the plan wasn't very clear because it seems like the guy or the devil in his head didn't really think this attack through in detail. Not even close, because if that were the case, he probably wouldn't have jumped into a taxi and sped through red lights on the way. Well, I mean, things like that don't help you stay unnoticed and hide.
I started gathering my things. At the moment when I got ready, I ran out and told the taxi driver. He didn't understand me at first. Then I told him, when I pulled out the knife, "Hurry up, I'm worried about you." He said yes, okay, and ran out of the taxi. You pulled out a knife and started threatening the taxi driver, am I right? Yes, that's exactly what happened. After that, he replied to me like, "Okay, we'll go now." He ran out, grabbed his bag through the window, and shouted at me to get out of the car. I moved to the driver's seat, pressed the gas pedal, and started driving out of my neighborhood.
According to Mykyta, the devil's voice stayed in his head until he ran through the courtyards towards Studentska metro station. That is, after committing a double car accident, one of which resulted in the death of a pedestrian. In the courtyards of Kharkiv, the young man, as he himself said, started to come to his senses and realize what was happening. And when the police caught him, he supposedly consciously and voluntarily agreed to cooperate and sincerely confessed how everything happened.
How this story about the triple murder of a family will end is currently unknown. From the court documents available to the public, it only follows that the young man was given a preventive measure in the form of detention. He does not have the right to post bail to await the verdict outside of the cell. It remains to be seen if the young man will be deemed sane. Subscribe to my channel for updates. On my channel Buck Over Crime, we investigate criminal cases, delve into the psychology of criminals, and analyze the most high-profile cases that have shaken society. No crime will escape our attention. If you, like me, can't fall asleep until you know all the details of a high-profile case, you've come to the right place. Make yourself comfortable and join me on a journey through the dark corners of human actions. Together, we'll look behind the scenes of crimes, analyze the evidence, and try to understand the motives of the criminals. One way or another, even the boy's lawyer isn't giving any clear or definite comments at the moment.
I have a question. The fact that he remembers everything, that he tells everything in detail and thoroughly, maybe these are actually some symptoms of the illness. I don't know. We'll see. There will be an investigation, there will be an examination, and by talking to specialists, we'll figure it out.
As soon as the incident happened, the police assumed that the butcher was under the influence of drugs. Later on, there was no confirmation or denial of this information. The true facts remain unknown. Currently, the young man is suspected of committing crimes described in the pages of the Criminal Code of Ukraine. These are violations of traffic rules, illegal seizure of a car, and the intentional murder of several people committed in one place and within a short period of time. Yes, there really is such a clarification. For all this, the offender faces life imprisonment. But whether his guilt can be proven, or perhaps the Kharkiv resident will be sent for treatment so he no longer hears the voices of the devil, is for the court to decide. According to open sources, the final hearing in this case has not occurred yet. So it's worth following the developments further, as my colleague Ms. Barkova said. Check out her channel for lots of interesting content. She does a great job and deserves a like. Well, that's all for today, dear, but we'll see each other again this month. A few cases, including some from Kharkiv, will remain, but not involving the Kharkiv monsters. So, take care of yourself and see you soon.